horse. So as my troops are investing Vicksburg, we're fanning out looking for more horses for our army. And my troops brought in a couple of horses that looked like they had real possibilities. One was a Shetland pony, 14 hands high. And for those of you who don't know, a hand is a way to measure the height of a horse, and it's about 4 inches. So this was a Shetland pony about 14 hands high. I named him Jeff Davis, and I gave him to my son. My son Fred was 13 years old, and he had accompanied me at Vicksburg. So I gave Jeff Davis to my son Fred. But the other horse that had been brought in, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, that was Little Rebel. It was Little Rebel who was 14 hands high, Little Rebel. Jeff Davis was actually the horse that I wound up using. Jeff Davis, in fact, was such a hardy animal. He survived the war, and he came with me to the White House. He was in the White House stables for many years. So, we have Kangaroo. We have Jeff Davis. The higher you rise in rank, the more horses are put at your disposal. By the end of the war, I had 7 or 8 horses, which I could use at any time. Most were for ceremonial purposes. The war horses were the ones I truly treasured. But did I have accidents? Yes, I did. My carbuncle cleared up very well as I rode Jeff Davis. But I did have accidents, and the one I will share with you is this. We had defeated the enemy at Vicksburg. The Mississippi was now open. And in August of '63, I was down in New Orleans consulting with General Banks. He was the commander of the Army of the Gulf. We had to figure out the next step in the war, the next offensive to begin. And of course, when you're visiting another general, there will be moments where you have to inspect the troops. So Banks gave me a horse, and I could see from the start, this was a very high-strung animal. But high-strung animals had never worried me before. I'd conquered them. I felt I could conquer this creature. So we're riding out where the troops are lined up at Carrollton, which is not far from New Orleans. The path we are riding, for a little ways, parallels a railroad track. And all of a sudden, around a blind turn, comes an engine with a whistle screaming. And my horse rears up and pitches to the left, and that's all I remember. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I was able to hear what the doctors were saying, they said, the horse fell on you, and you're seriously injured. The injuries from my knee up to my thigh began to blow up like a balloon, so much the skin almost broke open. And then the swelling came up to my armpits, and I was in agony, virtually unable to move for almost 2 months. Almost 2 months. That was my most serious riding accident of the war. And I think my recovery was interrupted because I was needed. I was needed at Chattanooga. President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton sent me a telegram saying the Union Army is besieged at Chattanooga. Bragg's Confederates are on the mountaintops. The city is virtually encircled, and our army is starving to death. Can't get supplies in or out. We need someone who is used to winning to find a way to break the siege. And Grant, we want you. So I had to go to Chattanooga. And it was not easy. There was, as I say, the city was virtually encircled by the rebels. There was one very narrow path through the mountains. Not wide enough for supply wagons, just wide enough in most places for a horse and a rider. Here's how badly off I was. I carried crutches on that horse because I knew when I dismounted I could barely walk. There were places on that trail where there had been landslides and a horse could not go. There were points on that trail. Well, a horse and rider couldn't. You could lead a horse if you were very careful. I was literally carried in a stretcher on parts of that trail, and on one occasion on the back of an enlisted man to reach Chattanooga. It was an incredibly difficult trek. But we got there, we won the battle, Chattanooga was freed, and it was a happy ending to that story. This, just as a note, was the last battle that William Tecumseh Sherman and I were in together. I was shortly to be called east. But around this time, Sherman and I were becoming fairly well known, and reporters were badgering us all the time for interviews. Sherman hated reporters. He wasn't going to talk to them in any case. And I was not going to talk strategy to civilians. So we were not granting interviews. And there was one reporter who was so frustrated with us, he thought, I'm going to find a way to get those men to talk. So he actually wrote down a checklist of topics he thought were harmless and we might be willing to talk about. Hobbies, games we liked. And Sherman showed me this checklist and he said, you know, Grant, this is really funny. If you're willing to talk to him at all, I suggest you say you'll talk about horses. You're good at that. You can go on for hours. I think I will talk about dancing. William Tecumseh Sherman. Can you picture him dancing? The man who burned Atlanta. He was fairly good as a dancer. I will give him some credit, but he checked that just to frustrate the reporters further. That was the only reason he did it. I don't even know why I thought of that. But in any case, we won the Battle of Chattanooga. And I'm on my way to St. Louis when I receive a letter. It was written by a gentleman who wanted to give me a horse. Now, I come from a fairly large family. One of my brothers was Samuel Simpson Grant. He died in 1861 of cancer. He always signed his letters S.S. Grant. And the man who wrote me this letter after Chattanooga signed his letter S.S. Grant. Now, I'm not superstitious, but it did intrigue me. So I decided, though I got many letters like this, I will actually meet this gentleman and look at his horse. Well, this S.S. Grant, in fact, was dying, and he wanted to give me his favorite horse. His favorite horse was named Cincinnati. This is a picture of Cincinnati. Cincinnati was 17 hands high. He was a really big horse. Down here, by the way, is a little sketch of Sherman and myself at Chattanooga. This was drawn by a correspondent for one of the Eastern papers. Cincinnati, it turned out, was a Kentucky thoroughbred. He was the son of Lexington. And if you know anything about horses, you've heard of Lexington. He was the fastest 4-mile thoroughbred of that era. He could run 4 miles in 7 minutes and 19 seconds, and Cincinnati was almost as fast as he was. S.S. Grant asked that if I were to accept Cincinnati as a gift, that I treat him well, that I never harm him or hurt him. And that was an easy promise for me to make, because as I've told you, I would never inflict pain on an animal, especially not on horses. So, Cincinnati became my horse. And it was Cincinnati I would ride to Appomattox when I met General Lee. I was offered $10,000 for Cincinnati, and I refused. Now, well, I only let 2 other people ride Cincinnati. One was President Lincoln, and the other was Admiral Ammon. Now, I know you don't remember stories from our Navy during the war, but Admiral Ammon was a very famous, well, he was an admiral. It goes without saying that he was very accomplished. But more than that, he and I had grown up together in Georgetown. And when I was 9 years old, we were down at the swimming hole, and I began to drown. And Daniel Ammon saved my life. Ergo, I would let him ride Cincinnati anytime he wanted. Another horse I acquired, this was in January of 1864. The people of Illinois wished to give me a gift of a horse. This horse's name was Egypt because for some reason, according to tradition, Illinois is divided into two quarters. The northern part of Illinois is called Cairo and the southern part Egypt, and I don't know why, but the horse they gave me was named Egypt, and Egypt came with me to the White House eventually too. City Point, Virginia. The siege of Petersburg went on for months and months and months. My headquarters were in one place. We were not moving. And when you're in a situation like that, where your headquarters are, when the battle is siege warfare, your headquarters is not a moving target, your family can come visit you. So Julia and my children often came to visit, and so did President Lincoln and his family. And I have a story to tell you about a day we all went out riding together. On this particular occasion, it was President Lincoln, Mrs. Lincoln, and their son Tad. My wife, myself, and our youngest, Jesse, who was 7 or 8. I was riding Egypt. President Lincoln was riding Cincinnati. Jesse was riding the Shetland pony, Little Rebel, Little Rebby, and Tad was riding Jeff Davis. Tad was unable to control Jeff Davis. So he and my son switched horses, and my son, fancying himself a great rider at the age of 8. Now, I was a great rider at the age of 8. But Jesse had still some things to learn. He underestimated how the mood that Jeff Davis was in. The second Jesse sat on the saddle, Jeff Davis was off and running like he'd been shot out of a cannon. I immediately galloped after them. President Lincoln, right at my side. We had some officers with us. They're giving chase. And I was watching, and I saw my son's horse, as we were gaining, speed up. Clearly his horse thought we were in a race. And it was going to win. So I said, I yelled to the president, rein in, rein in. And we all reined in. We looked down the pasture, and some of our troops were down there, a little tent city. They saw my son on his runaway horse. They saw him coming. The soldiers, thinking quickly, linked arms and made a human wall, which, when the horse and rider came up, channeled the horse and rider into a corral. And once Jeff Davis was in the corral, he calmed down. My son was fine, but mortified, absolutely mortified, in front of Tad Lincoln, embarrassed in front of one of his friends. And he was doubly mortified because for the rest of that outing, a soldier held the reins of Jeff Davis, and my son had to ride, kind of holding his breath. You know how it is with children. You know how it is. Regarding horses in the war, there was a moment, one of those moments that in a way haunts me. Petersburg finally fell. Now, you've heard the stories of when Richmond fell. President Lincoln walking the streets of Richmond virtually unguarded. Petersburg fell first. It was the first domino. Once Petersburg fell, Richmond had to be abandoned by the Confederacy. Petersburg had fallen, and President Lincoln and I rode into Petersburg together. And my wife, Julia, was riding beside us. And the city was a ghost city. It had been shelled for months. It was a skeleton of a city. And the only sound we could hear were the hoofbeats of our horses. And then I heard another sound. Crying. My wife broke down. So what I remember of Petersburg, the sound of the horses' footsteps and my wife sobbing. Julia was a Southern belle. We had married before the Civil War. She came from a slave-owning family. Her loyalties weren't divided. She was for the Union, but she had relatives who fought for the South. And as we rode through Petersburg, she was weeping for all who had been lost, Yankee or rebel. And I will always remember that moment. Another thing, I'm sure you don't know this. Richmond was abandoned. The Army of Northern Virginia is running. Their plan is to run as far west as they can and then head south, hoping to link up with the last other Confederate army still in the field, Joe Johnston's army in North Carolina. We caught up with them, as history knows, at Appomattox Courthouse. What history doesn't know is if the pursuit had had to go on one more day, they would have escaped. And here's why. It was spring. It was very early April. Grass was just beginning to come up. The Confederate horses had eaten what grass there was. As we came up in their wake, there was nothing for our horses to eat. The forage, which we could bring to them in wagons, were days behind us. We had been moving so fast. There was no food for our horses. If we had had to stay in pursuit one more day, I would have had to have stopped and waited for the supply wagons with the horses' forage to catch up, and Lee might have escaped. Horses figured in many ways you can't imagine in the outcome of the war. And I also think that they counted for something very special at the surrender. You know, I told Lee and his men that they could go home, that if they would pledge their loyalty to the United States government, they were free to go and no one would molest them. But I also let them keep their horses. And I think this made an incredible difference to the ordinary enlisted man who, after all, was a farmer. It was spring. The southern fields had been destroyed many times over. They were going to go home to desolation. They had to replant and start over, and without their horses, they couldn't have done any plowing. They could not have started over. I think without their horses, they might have decided fighting on was a better option. So being allowed to keep their horses, I think, was a great factor in bringing the peace. Well, I got to the White House, as you know, and they wouldn't let me ride horses anymore. It was too dangerous. They would only let me go out in carriages and buggies. Little did they know that carriages and buggies can go very fast too, and I like to go fast. So, though I could not ride out alone, I went out many, many times in carriage rides. My granddaughter Julia, she was just a wee little thing when we were in the White House. I'm thinking now she was perhaps 3 or 4 years old. I convinced her at age 3 or 4 that she was a great horsewoman. We get in the White House, the Executive Mansion carriage. I'd be sitting down, and my little granddaughter would stand between my legs. She'd be holding the reins, and of course, I would be holding the reins right behind her. And she was sure she was guiding those horses through the streets of Washington. It's one of my fondest memories. Little Julia and I riding in those carriages. I think when I am long gone, this will probably be one of her finest memories too. Which reminds me, I haven't told you about my own children and how they were as horsemen and horsewomen. My eldest son, Fred, he knew a bit about horses. When he graduated from West Point, he actually went into the cavalry. My middle son, Buck, knew absolutely nothing about horses. My youngest son, Jesse, knew less than nothing about horses. My daughter, Nellie, on the other hand, she had some talent as a horsewoman. She had 2 favorite horses, Jenny and Lady Morgan. She often would be out on carriage rides in Washington, D.C. And matter of fact, on her wedding day, she was married in the White House. I gave her, as a wedding present, a trotting horse and a very light American buggy. My daughter, the horsewoman. I acquired another horse while I was in the White House. Here's the story. This actually happened. You know, the family and I, we have a cottage on the Jersey Shore at Long Branch. And I was out riding in one of my buggies. When up behind me came a delivery wagon. It was a butcher shop was delivering meat to customers. The wagon passed me and stopped up ahead to make the delivery. Of course, I kept going right around the wagon. And some minutes later, the wagon's behind me again and passes me and stops, makes a delivery. And I pass him. And a third time, this delivery wagon passes me. And I suddenly realized the horse pulling that wagon is spectacular. It is one of the strongest animals I've ever seen, and fast, very fast. So the next time I came up parallel to the delivery wagon, I offered the driver $280 on the spot for his horse. And he sold it. I named him Butcher Boy, and he wound up in the White House stables. My stableman, Albert Hawkins, he and I were kindred spirits when it came to horses. Now, Albert had been born a slave. We had nothing in our educations that were similar, but we both had this appreciation of horses. And Albert, he loved the horses in the White House stable so much. He often would eat lunch in the stables, and he would just chatter away all day talking to the horses. They would recognize his voice. When Albert came into the stable, he would greet them. Stable doors would be open, and Cincinnati would come out of his stall, and Albert would get a little square of sugar, a cube of sugar, put it in his mouth, and Cincinnati would come over and take the sugar cube out of Albert's mouth and swallow it. And so would Egypt. They loved Albert, and he loved them. On the other hand, Jeff Davis, he was an irascible old horse. He never would do something so intimate with a human being. But Cincinnati and Egypt, they loved Albert and trusted him completely. Now, I have a question for you. I know you've heard the story. I want you to tell me if it's true or if it's a fable. One day in Washington, D.C., I'm out in my carriage, and I am speeding down one of the thoroughfares in Washington when a mounted policeman sees me and pulls me over for speeding. And I am fined $5. Is this a true story or is it false? True. It's absolutely true. I was pulled over for speeding. Now, there are some details here that I don't mind at all. First of all, the officer was right. I was going much too fast. I was potentially a danger to pedestrians. But this officer was a black man. And when the slaves were freed and I became president, I wanted to make civil rights real for them. And I wanted to make opportunities real for them. So I opened up the civil service to black people, and the Washington, D.C. police force began recruiting and enlisting black men to be policemen. It was very radical at the time, and this officer who pulled me over was black. And I thought, he's doing his duty, and I'm going to support it, even if I have to pay a $5 fine. But it is a true story. I was pulled over for speeding. After the White House years, Julie and I went on an around-the-world tour. It took 2 years to complete. But there is a horse story connected with our travels. We were in Turkey, in Constantinople, and the Sultan wished to give me a gift. He had an aide take me down to the royal stables, and the aide said, "The Sultan wishes you would pick out your 2 favorite horses from the stable." About 40 horses there, and I examined every one. And I picked 2 that I thought were the best, and the aide turned white He said, General Grant, those are the Sultan's favorites. Could you pick the next two that you like? And I did. They were gray Arabians. I was told their lineage predated the Prophet Muhammad. They were pure stock. When they came to America, the public went crazy. I know you may have heard some of the stories. They wanted to see purebred Arabian horses. And when my horses were, say, having new shoes at a blacksmith shop, when they're being shod, there would be old nails lying around, old shoes, clippings from their hooves. People were grabbing these as souvenirs. These two horses, called Leopard and Linden Tree, appeared on posters. They became a fad. They had fans. They had more fans than I did. Ultimately, I had them board with my old friend Admiral Ammons, who had a horse farm in Maryland. And the public was a little disillusioned at one point because some expert on horseflesh decided that perhaps Linden Tree was not a purebred Arabian. Perhaps he was a Barb. Barb is a corrupt term from Berber. The Berbers are nomads in North Africa, fabulously accomplished horsemen. This skeptic said, Linden Tree is a Barb. Well, I tell you, the public didn't care. The public still is crazy about them, and so am I. So, purebred or not, well, it's like kangaroo. You cannot judge a book or a horse by its cover. Never do that. Just a few more items before I close. At West Point, as a cadet, I accrued many demerits. All of us did. Tell me, is this true or false? I was called before a board to look into my transgressions, and they said, Cadet Grant, we understand that you kicked a horse. And my defense was, it was self-defense, he kicked me first. True or false? False. Absolutely false. I would never hurt Ned. No. But that story did get around. True or false? This will tie in with horses and mules in a moment. I have never used profanity in my life. Now remember, I made a career as a military man. True or false? I never used profanity.
True.
That's right. My theory was we do not use profanity in the presence of ladies. Why should we use it in the presence of gentlemen? However, during the Mexican War, there's nothing more stubborn than a Mexican mule. And we had to bring supplies up to the front. I was a regimental quartermaster. It was my job to get the supplies there. And we had this group of Mexican mules that just dug in their heels and they would not move. And the muleteers, who were foul-mouthed to begin with, were using every curse word in English and Spanish to get those mules to move. And it was the one time I had become so frustrated, I came that close to using profanity. All right. True or false? During the Battle of the Wilderness, there was a teamster bringing a wagon load of supplies to the front, and his horse was giving out, and he was whipping and whipping and whipping that horse, and the horse was about to fall over dead, and I lost my temper, and in the midst of the battle, I had the teamster tied to a tree for 6 hours to think about what he had done. True or false?
True.
That is true. I will say this, the battle was going on over there. The teamster was tied here, so there was a tree between him and the bullets, so he wasn't really in danger, but he thought he was. And so I don't think he would ever abuse an animal again. Well, finally, a reporter did ask me, a reporter accompanied us on our around the world tour. He started asking me questions, not about the war or the presidency. And he hit upon my two favorite subjects, and I said, you have discovered my weaknesses, my family and my horses. And I won't talk about my family, that's entirely private. But for hours and hours I talked about horses. And I like to think, when I become old and decrepit and I'm barely able to, here's my dream for my real retirement. I want to have a horse farm. And I want to raise and train colts. And I have this image of being in an arena of some sort. And I'm old and I'm feeble. And I'm seated in a chair. And on a long line I have a colt. And it's a swivel chair. And the colt is running carefree around the ring. And I'm sort of being spun around gently. That is my dream for old age. Horses and me. Thank you.